Hi, it's Kate, and welcome to my hobby board. I've just acquired a loom and just started weaving, and I received a couple of different questions, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the loom and the different parts of it, and then do a little weaving. So to start off with, this loom is the Ashford Rigid Heddle loom. It's 32-inch weaving area. Ashford is a producer of all things fiber from New Zealand. They make really beautiful looms and spinning wheels in particular. This is, it's called the Rigid Heddle. Ashford makes two different Rigid Heddle looms, the Knitter's loom and the Rigid Heddle. This is the Rigid Heddle. It doesn't fold. It's it's not designed to be portable, though at only this size it's relatively portable. So a rigid heddle loom differs from one of the other kinds of looms that you may have seen, the big floor looms or a table loom that has pieces that has heddles that move up and down and has pedals or switches that you flip to raise and lower the different heddles to create the design in the pattern in the fabric itself. Instead, it has this. So this is a rigid heddle. I'm going to run over here. What it is, in this case, is wood and plastic. It has all of these little plastic pieces that have the little lines, I guess, of plastic with a little hole in them. And that's what you use for both threading the warp, which determines the pattern, and as the beater as well for compacting the yarn. It's called a rigid heddle because, well, they're rigid. They come in different sizes. This is a 10, which means that there's 10 ends or 10 yarns in an inch, and that's usually how they're designed. So the other one that I have is a 7.5 or an 8. With one like this, I can weave basically two shaft weaving patterns, and the most common of which is just your plain weave. This comes off, and I'll just take it off for a second, and you can see this piece here, and I'll move just a little bit. This piece here, which it was sitting in, how there's two kind of mirror images. This is what allows you to raise and lower the threads to create the movement in the warp. With having both of them, it means that I can have two of these on the loom at the same time, which would allow me to do 4 shaft weaving. For now, I'm going to learn with just 2, but I really wanted to have the ability to do 2. It gives more variety in terms of the patterns that you can achieve in the fabric itself without having to actually do the patterning in color. And it also allows what I would like to get to do at some point, which is double weaving. So being able to weave either twice as much width of fabric by basically weaving it folded over, or weaving 2 pieces at the same time. So putting the heddle here in the top slot raises up the pieces that have been of yarn that are through the holes in the heddles, and the pieces that are loose inside the slots go down to the bottom. When you put it down to the bottom here, those ones in the holes go down and the other ones come up, and that creates what you can see here, this space, this little triangular space, and that's called the shed. This is a shuttle, a stick shuttle, creatively named. You wind the weft, or the yarn that goes backwards and forwards across the fabric, onto the shuttle, and then use the shuttle to pass it back and forth. The shuttle goes, I'm going to put my heddle in the right position. It goes through the shed, out the other side, and then the yarn is beaten in place. And this is not how I would normally weave, so it is kind of awkward, so I apologize. The threads that go back and forth here that are along here are the warp threads. Those, so the whole process starts with warping. So determining how much yardage you need, all the rest of that, and then winding the warp through the heddles, through the slots, and winding it onto that back beam, and then getting it so that everything's neatly through the slots and the holes, and then tied to the front, and then all of the warp is wound around that back bar, and as you weave you pull it forward and it goes onto the front one as fabric. The movement of the heddle up and down will raise and lower, or basically change which threads are on top and which ones are on bottom. When you combine that with the weft going through, that's what creates the fabric effect, and gives you, the weaving effect, and gives you fabric. Other pieces to comment on, the little pieces of green here are just little strips of cardstock that I'm using to separate the warps so they don't get tangled, and just to provide some extra even cushioning under the fabric. The idea is that not only does it prevent it from getting damaged and tangled, but it also helps to make sure that things wind on evenly, because tension is pretty much one of the most important things when you're weaving, to make sure that it's even. The warp threads, in this particular project, the warp is an acrylic. I'm usually kind of a yarn snob and don't use acrylic, but this was really pretty and I'm just learning, so I figured why not. It also is really quite soft, so it's going to make a nice scarf. The warp threads have to be very strong because they're under tension. This doesn't have a lot of give, so they have to be able to handle that. It's something that you could pull apart. So a loosely spun yarn, most singles and certain fibers that just don't lend themselves to making a really, really strong yarn, or things that are more loosely spun, aren't going to work for warp. Between this rubbing up and down all the time over it and the amount of tension that it's under, you would just break it, and that would make your life miserable. You can use, looser yarns, looser spins, and other fibers more for going across, because it's not going to be under as much strain, but it needs to be at least enough that you can pull it and beat it without it disintegrating on you. What I'm using for weft here is a merino tencel blend in a lace weight. It's a leftover from a shawl that I had done, and my goal was to kind of show off the color transitions that were in the warp yarn, and also to see what would happen if I did my warp and my weft different weights. I may suffer for that later, given that one is acrylic and one is wool. We'll find out when I wash it what that does. But the main thing was to see what's the effect, and how much of the color am I still getting through with the warp. One of my long-term goals, aside from the whole weaving things double, is to be able to take advantage of some of the beautiful hand-painted fingering weight yarns that are out there for making things like scarves and shawls, and using a smaller warp in a neutral color or a coordinating color to really show off what the beautiful hand-painted yarn. So this is going to give me an idea of what some of that might look like, as well as the experience of weaving with those weights of yarn. This warp might be a little bit heavier than some of the fingering weights, but it's not too much heavier. So what I'll do is I'll do a little bit of weaving so that I can show that, and then also some of advancing the warp. So winding the fabric on and advancing more of the warp in the back, and I'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to stop the video for a second, raise the table up because that's way too low for me to weave on, and I will be right back with you.